Can anybody hear me?
I can hear you.
Good. Yeah. Well, I switched machines. I'm on a new machine, so I guess we're back, and I think we're okay.
We're still not okay because we wanted to share a video.
I'd love to see a video. I love videos. Right. I don't know anything about any permission being asked or not asked or anything else.
We're not able to show it, Mr. Chairman. I mean, we'd like to.
What is the video? Give me an idea.
A video of people objecting on January 6, 2017, to the counting of the electors when President Trump won on January 6, 2017.
Well, I have no idea. I don't know anything about that, but the fact is that's not really particularly, and I don't mean to be argumentative or anything, Mr. Jordan, but that's not relevant. We're not going into anything that happened with any of that stuff.
Not relevant? The chairman of the House Administration Committee just released a 2,000-page report going after 140, oh, not part of this hearing? You got to be kidding me. 140 some Republicans?
That's the House Administration Committee, not us.
That's not part of not part of this hearing, and I don't really know.
Well, she's a member of the Judiciary Committee.
She's not a member of this subcommittee, and as you well know,
she's a member of the Judiciary Committee.
So what? That doesn't mean she's not a member of the subcommittee.
Well, Ranking Member Johnson just read a letter talking about this very issue. This is entirely relevant. That report comes out a few days ago, and you have this hearing this week. Just coincidence?
The report was
let me suggest, if some technical difficulty is preventing that video, why don't you just describe the video so we understand it, and let's proceed.
I'll read my statement. President Biden campaigned on a promise of unity, but Democrats in the House, like Chairman Lofgren, are putting together reports that attack Republicans, over 140 Republicans.
Mr. Jordan,
let's be clear. Chairman Lofgren's report is a 2,000-page.
We can't see you now. I can't see him. We're gone out.
I can see him fine.
I can't see him, and I can't see anybody other than myself now. I see Mr. Jordan has just popped back on.
I mean, this has just been, it took us 30 minutes to get on to it was such a mess. I mean, this is a comedy of errors, this whole hearing. Democrats in the House, like Chairman Lofgren, are putting together reports that attack Republicans. Chairman Lofgren's report is a 2,000-page political opposition dossier put together at taxpayer expense. Think about that. Taxpayer dollars used to target fellow members of the United States Congress. Chairman Cohen went on television and accused without evidence Congressman Boebert of helping criminals storm the Capitol without a bit of evidence. Other Democrats have filed frivolous resolutions to censor or expel Republican members.
Mr. Jordan, would you yield for a minute?
So much for unity. Be happy to yield to the chairman.
Thank you. This has never been made clear. All I said on television is I saw Ms. Boebert going with a group of people in the tunnel. I then said I didn't see anybody involved in the insurrection, and I also said this very well may have just been the historical record of her getting sworn in for the first time, and people wanted to go see it.
Come on.
You said go to CNN, Jim. Go to CNN, and you'll see that.
How about I read your? How about I read your quote? She's not on the home team. She was with the visitors. How about that quote?
That she's not on the home team. When you tweet 1776, you're not on the home team. But that doesn't have anything to do with her leading the insurrectionists. I said she specifically could have just been going up there for a celebration.
You know what? You know what you did, Mr. Chairman. Other Democrats have filed frivolous resolutions to censor or expel Republican members.
Go on with your
so much for unity. Was it my time, or are you just going to run the whole thing? Is it my time?
It's your time to you continue with your calumny.
Excuse me, I didn't hear what you said. Continue with what?
Your calumny.
Oh, well, I'll continue with presenting the truth. These same Democrats spent 4 years accusing President Trump of colluding with Russia, allegations we knew at the time were false, and now the whole country knows are completely false. 19 minutes, Mr. Chairman, 19 minutes into President Trump's term, the Washington Post read a headline, quote, "The campaign to impeach President Trump has begun." President Trump wasn't even done with his inaugural address, and you guys were working with the media to impeach him. And of course, the video I wanted to play talks about what happened on January 6th. But I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll just read from it. I'll read from the congressional record. Congressional Record, House of Representatives, Washington, Friday, January 6, 2017. Mr. McGovern, Mr. President, I object to the certificate from the state of Alabama. Mr. Raskin, state of Florida, he objected to. Ms. Jayapal, Mr. President, I object to the certificate from the state of Georgia. Ms. Lee, Mr. President, I object to the state of Michigan. Mississippi, Ms. Jackson Lee, Mr. President, I object. Mr. Grijalva, Mr. President, I object to the certificate from the state of North Carolina. Ms. Jackson Lee, Mr. President, I object to the state of North Carolina. Ms. Jackson Lee, I object to the votes from South Carolina. Ms. Jackson Lee, Mr. President, I object to the votes from Wisconsin. Ms. Maxine Waters, the state of Wyoming, is there one United States Senator who will join me in this letter of objection? So Democrats, think about this. January 6, 2017, the chairman of the Rules Committee can object to Alabama, a state President Trump won by 30 points.
Hello?
Yes, sir. You need me?
Yeah, you should probably mute though, Mr. Chairman, so I can, while I'm talking. Again, one more comedy of errors in this committee hearing. Mr. Raskin, the lead impeachment manager, can object to Florida in 2017, and Maxine Waters, chairwoman of the House Financial Services Committee, can object to Wyoming, a state that President Trump won by 40 points. But somehow Republicans, Mr. Chairman, aren't allowed to object to Pennsylvania, where they changed the law on. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, it's May 5th, and this is our first full committee hearing. There's a crisis at the border. The president is talking about abolishing ICE. Our local communities are being threatened by the left's movement to defund the police. You're trying to pack the Supreme Court. The teachers union are stopping kids from going to school. President Biden is bankrupting the country one omnibus bill at a time, and a virus continues to threaten our civil rights. But the House Judiciary's first full committee hearing this Congress is oversight of the Copyright Office. Now, look, we mean no offense to Register Perlmutter and the important work her office is doing. In fact, copyrights are a critical part of the U.S. economy, and it's an area ripe for bipartisan work. America's creators and distributors deserve our attention to make sure this is a well-functioning marketplace. We're all proud of the major pieces of copyright legislation that were signed into law in recent years, some that the chairman just talked about, including the Music Modernization Act and the CASE Act. And hopefully this is just the beginning. Last Congress, we began important work looking into Section 512 and other areas of the DMCA that can be improved. And it is our hope that consensus legislation can be identified and actually signed into law. We must keep a watchful eye over the collection and distribution of unclaimed royalties under the Music Modernization Act to ensure that trade associations and big publishers and wealthy artists are not profiting out on the back of those without the means to access the money that they are owed. Rampant online piracy of copyrighted movies, TV shows, music, and other content by criminals in China, Russia, and elsewhere must also be stopped, and bold steps taken to fight it, such as the felony streaming law we passed late last year. We must continue to look for ways to improve and modernize the copyright system so that it can continue to be the engine for job creation and economic growth for decades to come. I look forward to working with the Copyright Office. We've had a nice conversation with Ms. Perlmutter to take action on all of these vital issues, and appreciate that this hearing is an opportunity to help that along. But I hope that the chairman will finally start to pay similar attention to the many urgent problems facing Americans today, problems I hear about every single time I'm out in our district, as I am today, and as many of our colleagues are, problems that Americans want us to address, want us to deal with. I hope we get to them soon, Mr. Chairman. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Jordan. Without objection, all other opening statements will be included in the record. I will now introduce today's witness. Shira Perlmutter is the Register of Copyrights and Director of the U.S. Copyright Office. She was appointed to the position effective October 25th, 2020. Prior to her appointment as opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Here's the question. Do we think House Democrats want to stop big tech censorship of Republicans, big tech censorship of conservatives? Remember, 3 months ago, 2 Democrats wrote a letter to big carriers encouraging them to take Fox News, Newsmax, One American News off their platform. Chairman Nadler, Subcommittee Chairman Cicilline, Democrat Conference Chair Jeffries, Democrat Policy Chair Neguse, all impeachment managers. Do we really think they want Facebook to put President Trump back on their platform? Actually, we know the answer to that question. They don't. Chairman Nadler said, I think Facebook was right. They have a right to ban the president, even though these big tech platforms allow the Ayatollah to put tweets on there. They have a right to ban the president. Mr. Chairman said that it's a right-wing conspiracy theory and a fantasy dreamed up by some conservatives. Maybe that's because he hasn't been shadow banned like Congressman Gates has or Congressman Nunes. Subcommittee Chairman Cicilline said, we don't need to develop a solution for a problem that doesn't exist. Big tech censors conservatives. These bills don't fix that problem. They make it worse. They don't break up big tech. They don't stop censorship. Let's look at the access bill. This is the one that's supposed to be the least problematic. Let's just run through the access bill, what this does, the power it gives to the Federal Trade Commission. Page 15 of that legislation, the FTC shall issue standards specific to each covered platform. Covered platform is defined. Online presence, 50 million users a month, 100,000 business users a month, and a $600 billion market cap. That currently includes Amazon, Apple, Facebook, Google, but I think it's soon to include Microsoft, Walmart, Visa, and who knows where it ends. What's the process for issuing these standards for a covered platform? Page 17 of the legislation. By establishing technical committees for each business. So not one technical committee that advises. There will be a technical committee for each covered platform. One for Amazon, one for Apple, one for Facebook, one for Google, and then one for each new business that's added and defined as a covered platform. How big are these technical committees? Page 18 of the legislation tells us the size of the technical committee is at the sole discretion of the FTC. So whatever it can be, it could be 10 people, it could be a handful of people, it could be, I don't know. It's totally up to the FTC. Who's on these technical committees? Page 20. Page 20 of the legislation tells us 3 categories: competitors, people from advocacy groups and independent academics, and then someone from the National Institutes of Standards and Technology. Which sort of raises the obvious question, who runs the FTC? Until last week, the acting chair was Ms. Slaughter. Ms. Slaughter, who said it is, quote, perfectly appropriate for us to use antitrust enforcement tools to right the wrong of systemic racism. Wow. The new chair last week, Ms. Lena Khan, previously worked for Chairman Nadler, Subcommittee Chairman Cicilline, and House Democrats on the Judiciary Committee. So the person who helped write the bills that give all the power to the FTC now is going to run the FTC. Such a deal. The Federal Trade Commission, run by Biden Democrats who want to fix systemic racism, set up special government committees of whatever size they want, technical committees made up of your competitors, advocacy groups, and academics. Or in other words, people who want your business to fail, Soros-backed individuals, and someone like Senator Warren. Now, if you don't like the fact that you're a covered platform, you can petition the FTC. Page 4 and 5 of the legislation. And if the FCT doesn't like your petition, you can go to court. But your chances of winning in court aren't too good because on page 20 of the legislation, it says, in a proceeding for judicial review, the findings of the commission shall be conclusive. So I don't think your chances are going to be too well. Oh, and I forgot this. One more thing. Page 20 of the legislation. The Federal Advisory Committee Act shall not apply with respect to these technical committees. In other words, it's all done in secret. The Federal Advisory Review Act doesn't even apply. So secret technical committees for each business made up of left-wing individuals, advocacy, someone from academics, independent academics, that's who's going to decide. Now, do you really think the individuals running the FTC, again, as I said before, want Facebook to let President Trump back on? Do they want Twitter to stop shadow banning Matt Gaetz? A few months ago, Democrats brought in front of the committee a newspaper bill in front of this committee. The bill that would have allowed big tech and big media to collude. We had a great hearing on that. They've dropped that bill. Great hearing. I thought the witnesses pointed out the concerns with that legislation. Today we have bills that aren't big tech and big media working together, but big tech and big government now marrying up and working together. And frankly, we've already seen this. We've already seen this. We saw it with the recently released emails between Mr. Zuckerberg and Mr. Fauci, where we saw big tech and big government work together to frankly keep information from the American people, information that turns out may have been accurate. So that's our concern overall with the package. There are some bills that, okay, maybe all right, but overall the power this gives to the FTC, big tech working together with big government, doesn't address the issue of breaking these companies up, doesn't address the issue of censorship, which so many Americans are concerned about. That is our concern. We're going to have a number of amendments, Mr. Chairman. I know you guys have several amendments on your side as well. I look forward to a robust debate and as we move forward. With that, I yield back.
Anything you want to say in response to that?
Yeah. I want to say that the claim that H.R. 4 is a federal power grab rings hollow because Congress cannot seize power from the states that it already possesses. As a constitutional matter, neither Shelby County nor any other voting rights-related decision has diminished Congress' broad authority to eliminate voter discrimination that derives from the 14th and 15th Amendments, the Civil War, the Reconstruction Amendments, and from Article 1's Elections Clause. The Reconstruction Amendments fundamentally altered the relationship between Congress and the states, giving Congress broad powers to devise remedies to protect minority citizens' right to vote. The Elections Clause, which has been in the Constitution since the founding, establishes that Congress itself has the ultimate authority to determine regulations governing the time, place, and manner of elections to the House and Senate, so that any claim that we are taking over authority from the states is simply wrong, because the Constitution gives us that power and has since the beginning. As to the claim that H.R. 4 is partisan, this rhetoric is inapropos. I would remind my colleagues that Congress, under Republican control, reauthorized the Voting Rights Act in 2006 for 25 years. The VRA reauthorization passed by an overwhelming vote of 390 to 33 in the House and by unanimous vote in the Senate. President George W. Bush signed it into law. And as to the claim that this is a power grab by the Biden administration, or that the Biden administration is doing something wrong, the H.R. 4 and the underlying Voting Rights Act set out a framework for the Justice Department under any administration to evaluate laws affecting voting in certain jurisdictions. This bill will apply to President Biden's Justice Department in exactly the same manner as it will apply to any future president, whether Democrat or Republican.
Thank you. I know you admit, you miss me like a toothache.
I don't think you need to worry about the chairmanship position. There are things beyond your control there.
Right, I'm going, anyway, whatever. But thank you both for being here, and no other questions. You are dismissed. Thank you. All right, so that closes the, any other members wish to testify on S-Con Res 14? Seeing none, that closes the hearing on S-Con Res 14. I'd like to welcome our witnesses to provide testimony on H.R. 4, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act of 2021. Chairman Nadler and Ranking Member Jordan, we're delighted that you are here. I now recognize the gentleman from New York, Chairman Nadler, for whatever he wishes to say, and feel free to submit your testimony, written testimony for the record, and summarize, do whatever you want to do. Chairman Nadler.
Chairman McGovern and Ranking Member Cole, thank you for inviting me to testify today. H.R. 4, the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act of 2021, is critical legislation that would restore the Voting Rights Act of 1965 to its full strength. It is an urgently needed legislative response to the onslaught of discriminatory voting laws and practices that have emerged in the wake of the Supreme Court's 2013 decision in Shelby County versus Holder, which rendered the VRA's Section 5 preclearance regime inoperative. Before Section 5 became law, states and localities could implement a host of voter suppression laws, secure in the knowledge that it could take many years before the Justice Department could successfully challenge them in court, if at all. Even if one discriminatory law was struck down, jurisdictions would enact another to take its place, setting up a game of whack-a-mole. Section 5 broke this legal logjam by requiring states and localities with a history of discrimination against racial and ethnic minority voters to submit changes to their voting laws to the Justice Department for approval or to seek a declaratory judgment in court prior to taking effect. The Supreme Court's Shelby County decision gutted Section 5 by striking down the coverage formula that determined which jurisdictions were subject to preclearance. The court, however, also explicitly invited Congress to devise a new coverage formula to meet the, quote, current need to remedy voting discrimination. Over the course of 13 hearings during the last two Congresses, the House Judiciary Committee has built a substantial record demonstrating the ongoing and current need for Section 5 preclearance. Additionally, the House Administration Committee's Elections Subcommittee has conducted numerous hearings and issued a report on the matter. The combined record is clear. In the immediate aftermath of the Shelby County decision, several states swiftly passed voter suppression laws, including many state and local jurisdictions that had previously been subject to Section 5 preclearance. Adding new urgency to this already dire situation is the latest wave of voter suppression laws we have seen in response to the big lie that the results of the 2020 presidential election were impacted by widespread voter fraud. According to recent data, 18 states had enacted 30 laws that restrict the right to vote just since the beginning of this year, and nearly 500 other anti-voter bills are pending. Furthermore, as states begin the decennial process of redistricting, unless we pass H.R. 4 now, this would be the first redistricting cycle without the Voting Rights Act's preclearance regime in effect since its enactment in 1965. Without the full protection of the Voting Rights Act, thousands of minority voters could be disenfranchised for the next decade. H.R. 4 is a necessary response to address the critical state of voting rights currently facing our nation. Largely similar to the legislation that passed last Congress, H.R. 4 retains the core provisions of the prior bill while including additional enhancements to the VRA that respond to voting rights developments that have occurred in the interim. Foremost among these core provisions is a new coverage formula that revitalizes the VRA's most essential feature, Section 5 preclearance. This new formula targets those jurisdictions with a persistent pattern of voting discrimination and that continuously moves forward so that it only covers jurisdictions with a recent record of discrimination. The bill also retains a provision creating a nationwide known practices or practice-based coverage formula to supplement the traditional geographic formula if a jurisdiction's minority population meets certain threshold advantages. The most significant change to H.R. 4 is a new provision to address last month's Supreme Court decision in Brnovich versus Democratic National Committee. The Brnovich decision announced several so-called guideposts for lower courts to apply when resolving vote denial claims under Section 2 of the VRA. These guideposts, which had no basis in the statute's text and which run contrary to Congress's intent, appear to have constrained the scope of Section 2. As such, H.R. 4 would further clarify the scope of Section 2 by creating two legal tests the courts must apply to determine a violation of the statute. One for assessing vote dilution claims, such as in redistricting cases, and another for vote denial claims, such as voter ID laws. I also strongly encourage this committee to self-execute my manager's amendment, which makes certain clarifying changes and adds an administrative bailout provision to allow covered localities with no history of voting violations to quickly remove themselves from preclearance coverage. Despite the obvious need for the federal government to respond to the current attack on voting rights nationwide, some have labeled H.R. 4 as a so-called federal takeover of elections. Nothing could be further from the truth. As a constitutional matter, neither Shelby County nor any other voting rights-related decision has diminished Congress's broad authority to eliminate voter discrimination under the 14th and 15th Amendments or to regulate federal elections under Article 1's Elections Clause. H.R. 4 is named in honor of our late dear colleague John Lewis, who along with many other Americans shed his blood to secure passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. At this pivotal moment in our history, when there is a nationwide assault on the right to vote that threatens to disenfranchise minorities across the country, Congress must swiftly pass this critical legislation to protect our citizens and our democracy. I thank you for your consideration, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to you and Ranking Member and the members of the Rules Committee. H.R. 4 is just another attempt to exert federal control over states and localities. It's a partisan power grab. In 1965, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act to overcome pervasive state resistance and barriers that prevented minorities from exercising their right to vote. In 2013, the Supreme Court in Shelby County versus Holder held that continuing to require states to, quote, pre-clear election law changes based upon conduct from decades ago was an unconstitutional invasion of state sovereignty. The court recognized that, quote, the conditions that originally justified these measures no longer characterize voting in the covered jurisdictions. And that's a good thing. It means we've made progress. I mean, we should frankly be celebrating the amazing changes from what was happening, the wrong things that were happening in the 60s compared to where we are today with our voting laws. The court also found that if Congress drafts a new coverage formula, quote, exceptional conditions must exist to justify the extraordinary departure from the traditional course of relations between the states and the federal government. Thankfully, America of 2021 is not America of 1965. As I said, despite what Democrats want everyone to believe, these exceptional conditions do not exist. There is no recent record of rampant voter suppression or discrimination. In fact, minority participation in elections today is exceptionally better than it was in 1965. And during the 2020 election, voter turnout was higher across all racial groups. In fact, from the Shelby County decision, Chief Justice Roberts said, black voter registration before the VRA in Mississippi was 6.4%. Today, or actually in 2004, I'm sure it's higher today. 2004, 76.1%, higher than among white voters in the state of Mississippi. That's what you call progress. That's a good thing. We should celebrate that. Regardless of the data and the Supreme Court precedent, the Democrats still insist that a pre-clearance regime is necessary. The latest version of H.R. 4 is a federal takeover of elections contrary to the Constitution's clear intention. H.R. 4 includes a new coverage formula that would allow federal court to retain jurisdiction over state or political subdivision for 10 years if as few as 3 voting rights violations had occurred over the last 25. But H.R. 4 also takes a novel approach to determining and defining what's a violation, where a state or political subdivision can rack up voting, quote, voting rights violations without any final court judgment of discrimination. Someone just brings a claim. There might be some kind of settlement because the state or the local jury that doesn't want to spend taxpayer dollars, whatever, and go through a court decision, and that's going to be tallied up as a violation. Instead of settlement agreements and consent decrees, in addition to court orders and objections by the Attorney General, will suffice to trigger a violation designation. Let's be honest, the real aim of this provision is to utilize the pre-clearance process to allow the Democrats' political allies at the Department of Justice and other left-wing organizations to control state election rules in violations of the principles of federalism. H.R. 4's practice-based coverage provision doubles down on the unconstitutional pre-clearance formula. This provision is designed to target popular voter integrity measures by requiring every state and political subdivision to pre-clear certain election practices, including changes to voter identification requirements and changes to voter registration list maintenance processes with the Department of Justice. A recent poll found 81% of Americans support voter identification laws, but Democrats still want the Department of Justice to weigh in on this. Additionally, this bill creates a new extraordinary legal standard for courts to grant injunctive relief if the Voting Rights Act-related actions and impose burdensome reporting requirements on states and localities. H.R. 4, as introduced in the 117th Congress, includes a rewrite of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act in response to the Supreme Court's July 2021 decision in Brnovich versus the Democrat National Committee. Justice Alito, writing for the court, found that, quote, equal openness of election procedures remains the touchstone in establishing whether there is a violation of Section 2, and he set out a non-exhaustive list of factors for courts to examine during its totality of the circumstances review. The Democrats didn't hide the ball with this one. They specifically wrote in H.R. 4 that courts may not consider any of the factors Justice Alito laid out in his opinion. To justify the unconstitutional federal reach of H.R. 4, Democrats have argued that states have enacted allegedly suppressive voting laws. This is not the case. Simply not true. It's easier today for eligible Americans to vote than ever before in our nation's history. Voting remains a fundamental, constitutionally protected right in this country, and Republicans want every eligible citizen to vote and every legal ballot to count. But Democrats and their allies in this administration want to politicize the enforcement of the Voting Rights Act. Look no further than the recent actions from the Justice Department. In 2020, We all know about this because it happened in several of our states. In 2020, state and local governments were tasked with administering elections in a safe manner during a once-in-a-lifetime virus. Many states adopted temporary voting procedures to reduce public health concerns, sometimes in a manner that I clearly believe violated Article 2 of the Constitution, despite prominent public health officials saying that in-person voting was safe. But this administration is now telling states that if they want to return to the election procedures they had just 18 months ago, in some cases just a year ago, they could face litigation from the Justice Department. And this same Justice Department, the Biden Justice Department, is refusing to say whether it would review the process by which some states adopted the measures in the first place. So it can only ratchet one way here, according to the Biden Justice Department. And now we see the Biden Justice Department suing states that are trying to improve election administration by implementing voting integrity measures. What's telling, however, is that the Biden Justice Department is targeting only Republican-led states and ignoring Democrat-led states. Imagine that. Such as President Biden's home state of Delaware, that has more restrictive election administration laws than several of the states that have been in the news and have been targeted by this Justice Department. These changes in Republican-led states seek to not only enhance election integrity, but also increase the public's confidence in the election process. This is exactly how our country's voting system was set up to work. States and localities analyze what worked for them during the past election and then make changes accordingly. They do not need bureaucrats in Washington telling them how they should run their election. North Carolina's Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson said it best when he testified before the Judiciary Committee. As the chairman indicated, we've had a number of hearings. Mr. Robinson said this: "We need to stop this. The insinuation that somehow the people in Washington, D.C. know better than the people in North Carolina. You do not, and we will not tolerate it." End of his quote. We need to put an end to these partisan federal power grabs. States are the entities best situated to administer elections within their jurisdiction. I urge the committee to adopt an open rule on this legislation so Republicans can amend it to reflect the realities on the ground and not what's in the legislation. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Mr. Chairman, can I comment on what we just said?
Yeah, well, all right, let me go to, we'll go to questions, and then you can comment. How's that? Okay?
Well, I just want to say that...
Question, okay, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Or you can, anything you want to say in response to that?
Yeah. I want to say that the claim that H.R. 4 is a federal power grab rings hollow because Congress cannot seize power from the states that it already possesses. As a constitutional matter, neither Shelby County nor any other voting rights-related decision has diminished Congress' broad authority to eliminate voter discrimination that derives from the 14th and 15th Amendments, the Civil War, the Reconstruction Amendments, and from Article 1's Elections Clause. The Reconstruction Amendments fundamentally altered the relationship between Congress and the states, giving Congress broad powers to devise remedies to protect minority citizens' right to vote. The Elections Clause, which has been in the Constitution since the founding, establishes that Congress itself has the ultimate authority to determine regulations governing the time, place, and manner of elections to the House and Senate. So that any claim that we are taking over authority from the states is simply wrong, because the Constitution gives us that power and has since the beginning. As to the claim that H.R. 4 is partisan, this rhetoric is inapropos. I would remind my colleagues that Congress, under Republican control, reauthorized the Voting Rights Act in 2006 for 25 years. The VRA reauthorization passed by an overwhelming vote of 390 to 33 in the House and by unanimous vote in the Senate. President George W. Bush signed it into law. And as to the claim that this is a power grab by the Biden administration, or that the Biden administration is doing something wrong, the H.R. 4 and the underlying Voting Rights Act set out a framework for the Justice Department under any administration to evaluate laws affecting voting in certain jurisdictions. This bill will apply to President Biden's Justice Department in exactly the same manner as it will apply to any future president, whether Democrat or Republican.
Thank you very much. Let me do a couple of things. First, I want to ask unanimous consent to insert this statement of administration policy in support of H.R. 4 into the record. Without objection, I ask unanimous consent to insert a statement of support for H.R. 4 from Representative Jackson Lee. Look, I strongly favor this legislation, and it was written originally, and it's named after our dear friend and late colleague John Lewis, and who said the right to vote is not only precious, it's sacred. And I really believe that. And we have seen a number of states use baseless fraud claims fueled by the former occupant of the White House to move restrictive voting laws forward that really are intended at denying certain people the ability to vote, trying to suppress the vote. You know, I look at the craziness that's going on in Arizona with this ridiculous. Well, I don't know what the hell they're doing in Arizona, but it's just it is beyond the pale. And I really do believe that, you know, this is one of these moments where we're either going to stand up and protect our democracy or we're not. So I think this is incredibly important. You know, I never thought that the old issues of 1965 would be the new issues of 2021, but they are. And so, look, I think this is the right thing to do, and I hope that it gets a bipartisan vote. But let's not tiptoe around what is happening in this country right now, and it's really, really scary. I commend you, Chairman Nadler, for bringing this to us. I thank Ranking Member Jordan for being here, and I will now yield to the Ranking Member, Mr. Cole.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Jordan, the Voting Rights Act is permanent law, and it doesn't expire. Okay. You touched on this, but is there any creditable record of substantial and sustained voter suppression going on in the country right now that you're aware of?
Mr. Ranking Member, I would argue just the opposite. We're seeing more participation than we've ever seen before. I think we had 153 million
It's the highest turnout in 120 years.
Ever. Numbers-wise, percentage-wise, it was getting close as well. So, yeah, I mean, people are, the chairman mentioned we need to protect our democracy. I would just ask a simple question. Is it undemocratic to require an ID to vote? I don't think so. I mean, several states do it. This bill would make it harder for states to enact a photo ID requirement when you vote. And some people read it as making it for current states that already have a photo ID requirement, that they'd have to go check with the Justice Department to make sure that's still okay, even though that's been the pattern in practice in the law in their respective state. So, no, I think it's a great point. You're seeing record turnouts, increased turnout in the African American community, increased turnout Hispanic American community, increased turnout for all Americans in our elections, and that's a good thing.
Yeah, I would actually tell you, as an old pollster, it's one of the big challenges for pollsters is that the participation has been going up, so the old models in terms of trying to predict an election are getting a lot tougher to get right. And pollsters of both parties have had that problem. Does current law protect Americans from voter discrimination? Is the law pretty clear?
It's very clear, and frankly, that's what we want. If you got something happening that's diminishing in any way someone's ability to go vote, you want people who are doing that, you want them held accountable, and the law certainly does that, and that's a good thing.
And under current law, if an individual voter feels discriminated against, can he or she bring suit?
Sure can.
And under current law, if the Department of Justice feels as if some gross violation of rights, can they bring suit against discriminatory laws?
Sure can.
So, you know, given that, in your view, what's the purpose of the legislation that we're looking at?
I think it's to go after states who are trying to shore up voter registration list and make sure that people who haven't voted in, you know, whatever length of time or aren't supposed to be on the voter list, who have passed away or whatever, make sure that the voter registration list is accurate, and states that want to have a photo ID so that we know that, like in our state you have, when you go to vote, you have to do a signature match and you have to show a photo ID. There are 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats sitting in every single polling station, including Mad River Township B, where I vote, out in the country in Champaign County. It's a good system. That's what we want, and I think it's going to make it tougher for those kind of common sense practices that 81% of the country support to be enacted and put in place. We saw what happened when certain states tried to reform and upgrade their election law. The attack from the mainstream press and from so many Democrats. That's unfortunate, but look, we want everyone who wants to vote to be able to vote. We just want it done in a fair way.
No further questions. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Cole. Just a couple thoughts. I appreciate you gentlemen being here, but Colorado, we have a pretty open system that does really allow individuals, anybody who wants to vote, to be able to vote, and we've made it easy for them. And we end up almost every election after election, and this is under Democrats and Republicans, having the highest turnout of eligible voters across the country. We were second to Minnesota a couple years ago and second to Oregon a couple years before that. So, I mean, I think the purpose of this bill, and I've been able to support this before, Chairman Nadler, and I certainly support it again, is to make sure across America, anybody who wants. And so I don't know if you had any response to some of the comments Mr. Jordan was just making. If not, I'll pass to Dr. Burgess. Go ahead, sir.
I just want to comment. I think he said that 81% of people support a voter ID law. And there's nothing wrong with a voter ID law properly administered, and that's what the Voting Rights Act gets at. Because some states have said you must have a voter ID with your name and address. Well, on Indian reservations, there are no addresses. So that is discriminatory. Some states have passed voter ID laws that say that gun carry permits are proper IDs, but not state university IDs, and that's obviously designed to discriminate against certain voters and in favor of others. So this bill takes care of that by subjecting all those, like any other voting practice, to the judgment under the Voting Rights Act.
Thank you. I mean, for me, you know, a person's ability to vote is a say in their own future, however they choose to vote. And for just as a general principle, it should be easier for people to vote, not harder for people to vote. And quite frankly, I've seen over the course of the last 10 months, a number of states just making it harder, which is the wrong direction. So I'll yield to Dr. Burgess.
Thank you. Ranking Member Jordan, was there a hearing on this version of this bill in your committee? Has it ever come up in a previous Congress when you have had a hearing on similar legislation? The pre-clearance requirement from the Justice Department, you just make that applicable to every state rather than just certain states so that there could be uniformity.
Well, I think that's where this is headed. I mean, I think that I understand where you did sort of the premise of your question, but I think that's what they want. They want any change that any state's going to make. I think they now want it to be pre-cleared. That's the direction this legislation wants to go. They want the federal Justice Department, the federal government, to be signing off on any change that states make. And if I could, the chairman said he wants voting to be as easy as possible. I think we all want voting to be as easy as possible as long as it doesn't sacrifice the integrity of the vote. So there's two parts to that. It can't just be we want voting to be easy. Well, sure, I want it to be as easy as possible, but without in any way jeopardizing the reason you have a photo ID. This legislation will let people come in. They don't have a photo ID. They just attest that they're the person that they say they are. Well, maybe they are, maybe they aren't. That's why you want a photo ID. So that's the problem with this. In the chairman's home city, you can't go into a restaurant now unless you show an ID and show a vaccine passport. But somehow you can go into a place under the Democrats' legislation. You can go in. I don't have a photo ID. Are you Mr. Smith? I attest that I'm Mr. Smith. Okay, you get a vote. That's easy. But is that sacrificing voter integrity and the integrity of the election? I think probably so. Most Americans would agree with that. That's what we want to try to prevent.
Well, it does just strike me that 1965, my state, Texas, entirely controlled by Democrats, top to bottom, all statewide offices, state legislature, state senate. And the problems existed under a Democratic regime, and it has been corrected now under subsequent Republican administrations. I'll just offer that and yield back.
Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Raskin, you're recognized. If you're there. There you
are. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to ask Nadler a couple questions about the voting rights legislation. In the first place, was there not explicit invitation from the Supreme Court in Shelby County versus Holder to update the pre-coverage formula for deciding which jurisdiction to be covered under pre-coverage?
There was indeed. The Shelby County decision in 2013 invalidated Section 4, which determined which jurisdictions, which states, which political subdivisions of states were subject to preclearance under Section 5 on the grounds that it was out of date, that it didn't reflect current data, and it specifically invited Congress to update it under revised Section 4, which is exactly what this bill does.
And all of us can applaud the magnificent success of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 in wiping out a lot of the traditional barriers to voting participation. And we know, of course, those barriers go all the way back to the end of the Reconstruction period, literacy tax, poll taxes, character tax, and closure of polling places, hardships imposed on registering people to vote, and so on. The Voting Rights Act got millions more people involved in American politics and got them the right to vote because it dismantled those racist barriers to vote. And it succeeded in a lot of ways. But is there any reason to think that if we just got rid of the Voting Rights Act and we didn't update the Voting Rights Act, that there would not be further attempts to stifle voting by African Americans, Hispanic Americans, and other racial minority groups?
Well, there clearly would be. At the time of the Shelby County decision, which, as we know, stopped the pre-clearance on the grounds that it wasn't up to date. Immediately, several states reimposed voting restrictions that the Justice Department under Section 5 had said were discriminatory. And we know that would happen again. It happened before, and we have to update Section 4 to prevent that from happening.
Well, and in fact, are we not living through a terrible onslaught against voting rights across the country today? Are there not more than 400 bills that have been introduced to try to repeal or roll back early voting, weekend voting, mail-in voting, the accessibility of absentee ballots, and so on? In Georgia, where massive political organizing and voter turnout just elected 2 Democrats to the U.S. Senate, including the first African-American ever elected senator from Georgia, they just signed into law a very restrictive anti-voting measure that included making it a crime to pass somebody a bottle of water or a chocolate chip cookie while they're waiting in line to vote. So are we not in the midst of a massive effort to try to dismantle voting in the country?
We certainly are. As you said, we've seen over 400 bills introduced in various state legislatures to do this. And you mentioned the example in Georgia. You have to fill it out. Georgia, in fact, deliberately reduced the number of polling places in minority areas, thus creating the long lines, which it then seeks to make sure you can't help someone by giving them a cup of coffee or a donut or a glass of water while they're waiting on the long lines that the state created by closing the by closing the ballot location, the ballot the locations. So we've seen a clear pattern in many states. As you mentioned, over 400 bills have been introduced, and we have to revitalize the Voting Act, as we were invited to do by the Supreme Court.
And is this not precisely the role for Congress that's contemplated in the Reconstruction Amendments, in the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment? Do we not have the power to implement the meaning of those constitutional amendments precisely because people's right to vote is fundamental, even against their own state government, because state governments don't have the power to disenfranchise their own populations? Isn't it Congress to be guaranteeing a Republican form of government to everyone and guaranteeing everybody's right to vote?
Certainly, we have that right. As I mentioned before, the Reconstruction Amendments, the 14th and 15th Amendments, were designed specifically for that. And Congress always had that power under the Elections Clause, saying that Congress can define the time, places, and manner of electing Congress, but it had been so flagrantly disregarded that after the Civil War, the 14th and 15th Amendments were added to emphasize the fact, and the Voting Rights Act is enacted pursuant to those, so we clearly have the constitutional right to do this.
And don't both sides accept that federal law is paramount to state law? In fact, I think Donald Trump brought 61 different cases in federal court and state court to overthrow state election results, attacking them as unconstitutional under the federal Constitution. Now, his claims had no factual validity and they had no legal validity, but he was trying to overthrow state election results and basically did that all the way up until January 6th, when they tried to get Congress to nullify the election results being brought in by the governors from the particular states. Isn't that right?
That is quite correct.
Okay, well, Mr. Chairman, I would just say that we not only have the power, as Mr. Nadler says, and the right to vindicate the voting rights of all the people, I think we've got the obligation to do that as the Congress of the United States. I think we've got to do everything in our power to protect people's rights to vote against any kind of hostile legislation that they would face at the local, at the state, or the federal level. We have an obligation as the Congress under the Republican Guarantee Clause to guarantee to people a Republican form of government, meaning a representative form of government with everybody having the right to participate on the basis of one person, one vote, as the Supreme Court has said under the 14th Amendment cases. So I'm going to support this legislation, and we should do everything in our power to make sure that we are securing the rights of everybody to vote. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Raskin. Mr. Reschenthaler, you're now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. And I'd like to just associate my remarks with Ranking Member Jordan's and Ranking Member Cole's. And I just want to commend Ranking Member Jordan on laying out such a strong and compelling case. And with that, I'd yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Scanlon, you're now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, the right to vote is one of our foundational principles here in America, and it shouldn't be a partisan issue. Until recently, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was bipartisan. Since its passage, it's been reauthorized 5 times under both Republican and Democratic presidents, most recently in July 2006 under President Bush, George W. Bush. That reauthorization passed overwhelmingly in the House, unanimously in the Senate before being signed by the Republican president. Now, in 2013, the Supreme Court held in Shelby versus Holder that a critical part of the Voting Rights Act would no longer be enforced because the majority of the Supreme Court thought that it eliminated systemic discrimination of the type which had justified passage in the first place. But as Mr. Raskin said, the court invited Congress to examine the current state of affairs and update the Voting Rights Act. So this is an essential constitutional function that we're performing here. Unfortunately, during the past decade, or since 2013, we've seen that Congress refused to do that. From 2013 to 2020, the Republican Party controlled one or both houses of Congress. And for 4 years, the White House, and refused to respond to the Supreme Court's invitation. In addition, since the last census and redistricting, we've seen Republican-led radical and extreme gerrymandering efforts in my home state, and we've seen the enactment of numerous measures that make it harder eligible voters to exercise their right to vote. Now, not every state is going to be as lucky or unlucky, depending on your point of view, as my state was, because in our state, after enacting a series of voter suppression measures, Republican leadership got up in a meeting and in a recording said, yep, we gerrymandered, we enacted a strict voter ID law, we did all these things so that we could win elections, just for power purposes. And that helped people overturn those laws because there was a clear discriminatory intent. You know, we're not always going to get so lucky to be able to have a guy on tape, but it's important we update the Voting Rights Act to be able to address voter suppression tactics at the outset so that we don't have to go years, sometimes decades, when people's right to vote has been infringed. You know, it's not that the principles here have changed. It's that the Republican Party has changed and it's fallen further under the sway of the radical right. And that's why it's a partisan issue here. Chairman Nadler, you talked a little bit about some of the work that's been done in response to the Supreme Court's invitation to hold hearings and update the Voting Rights Act. Can you just summarize what has happened in Judiciary and with respect to the House Admin Committee?
Well, in Judiciary, we have held 13 hearings on this question. The House Administration Committee held, I think, 5 more hearings, and all on this question in this Congress. So the hearing record, we've created a very lengthy and detailed hearing record.
Thank you. And as Representative Raskin and I have participated in both those committees, I think the evidence is robust to support the legislation that's being put forward. So I urge everybody, whether in Congress or in the general American populace, to support this reauthorization. And with that, I yield back.
Representative Scanlon yields back. Representative Fischbach, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just very quickly, Chair Nadler, you said 13 hearings, and I know maybe I lost count, but none of them were specifically on this bill.
They were on this bill, yes. In the 116th Congress, in addition to this, we passed this bill in the 116th Congress.
Okay, so before my time. Right. So I've never been to a hearing that was specifically on this bill. So this Congress has never dealt with it. Is that the way I'm understanding it?
Yep.
We held those hearings in the 116th Congress, but the bill is substantially the same.
Okay, but there were many of us who weren't here and had no input onto this bill. And I just wanted to clarify that.
I wanted to clarify. You will recall we did have a hearing last week
on voting rights, not on this bill.
Right.
On many of the issues contained in this bill.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Well, and Mr. Chair, Chair Nadler, I was just trying to make sure I understood exactly because you said 13 hearings and I didn't recall one on this bill.
The bill was introduced 6 days ago.
Thank you. And Ranking Member Jordan, well, I've got your attention. You know, I mentioned that we sat through quite a few. I think there's 6 in the subcommittee that alone that I sit on. And I'm just wondering, you know, do you feel, Ranking Member, that there is a real need for this bill? I mean, are we seeing that there's some dire situation and things that you can point to? I know you kind of mentioned it in your opening, but I guess I'm just, after the kinds of
Well, thank you. Thank you for the question. The chairman just said a few minutes ago that since the Supreme Court's decision in Shelby County in 2013, so 8 years ago, he said there's been all kinds of voter suppression acts enacted and everything else. Well, if there have been, they're certainly not working. I mean, here's what the Chief Justice said. black turnout in the most recent election exceeded white voter turnout in 5 of the 6 states originally covered by the Voting Rights Act. So if there's been all this suppression that previous Democrats speakers have talked about, I'm sure it isn't working very well because we have record turnout, which is, as we've said now multiple times, the ranking member said it, I think all the Republicans, is a good thing. So of course that hasn't happened. I was also amazed by the previous, the gentlelady from Pennsylvania. She said, Republicans have engaged in extreme gerrymandering. And I almost started laughing because she comes from the state where the state Supreme Court, controlled by Democrats, just redrew all the districts in Pennsylvania in the middle of the 10-year cycle. And yet she has the nerve to say, oh, Republicans have engaged in extreme gerrymandering when their state Supreme Court did that. We all know we've had colleagues who were impacted by that. So again, I guess you could say all kinds of things, but it's nice if it's actually backed up by fact. And the fact is, we have record turnout. If there have been voter suppression acts passed in the last 8 years, they sure aren't working very well because record turnout amongst all groups, particularly African Americans, which, as I said, exceeded white turnout in 5 of the 6 states originally covered by the Voting Rights Act.
Thank you, Ranking Member. And Ranking Member, Section 3 of the bill, it creates a retrogression provision. I'm wondering if you could speak to that because it seems like this language is very broad and open-ended.
Right, and the general concern, I think, I appreciate bringing this point up as well. The general concern is this requirement that now to do anything different, you got to get an okay from the federal government. It's going to make it, I think, real. I think the focus is on voter ID, photo ID requirements. Third, I think, is this idea that certain states have a pretty strong photo ID, voter ID requirement. That may be in jeopardy current law. They may have to get the okay from the federal government for what they've been doing, have been doing, and are currently doing. And then finally, the fourth thing I think is all part of this that concerns me is this idea that you're going to have this tally. If you have some liberal interest group that sues your state on some concern about the election law, and you enter into some kind of settlement, some kind of consent decree, that's going to be counted as a mark against you, and it's going to further, you get so many bad marks, we'll call them, you're going to have the Justice Department coming after you as well. So that's all part of this concern I think we have with the legislation, not to mention the main point we made, which is we're just not seeing it. There's record turnout amongst all groups in the country.
And finally, Ranking Member, there is the provisions with the Attorney General and their ability to kind of reach in and before there's even real proof or anything. And I don't know if you'd like to comment on that.
Yeah, I was sort of, I guess I said some of that in my previous answer. What also concerns me about, and I think I had this maybe in my opening comments, is this idea that for those states, if you remember when Attorney General Barr left, he said if your state goes back to the law it had pre-pandemic, pre-COVID, you're fine. If you go back to the law that they had been in effect just a year ago and had been working fine and never had a problem, and no Justice Department in the Obama administration or the Trump administration had said any concern about it, that was presumed fine. Now the Garland Justice Department and the Biden administration is saying, nope, can't do that. If you're going to go back to where you were just a few months ago, that you're going to have to get the okay from the federal government. Meanwhile, at the same time they're saying that, they're saying we're not going to look at changes you made and whether those adhered to the Constitution or in any way may have violated someone's rights. We're not going to look at those. For example, I look at just the simple fact, Madison, Wisconsin, Dane County went to drop boxes. The legislature didn't pass that. They just decided we're going to have drop boxes during the last election. And now if the legislature says, well, we're no longer going to do that in this next election, that could be a concern. Because the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department say, well, that's going to hurt. That's going to be a violation. That could be a concern. When they just did it, the local clerk just made that decision. So that's I think, the big problem as well that we have with the legislation.
And then before
Jeffries was the last. So Mr. Johnson of Louisiana.
Mr. Chairman?
What? Mr. Jordan?
Yeah. Mr. Chairman, our witness was unable to stay. And And frankly, if we'd have started this committee on time, we'd have got to hear from her. She was doing an amazing job. Started 2 hours late, and then the Democrats add votes during the vote series that weren't scheduled, and now we have no witness.
Well, your staff indicated that that was fine at the time.
Indicate what was fine at the time. You started the committee 2 hours late?
Yes, we had a Democratic caucus, and we informed your staff, and they indicated it was fine.
Not aware of any indication to that effect at all. All I know is our witness can't be here. She had family commitments she had to get back home for.
I'm sorry, I don't know what we have 3 witnesses here. I don't know what the alternative is.
The point is, when you schedule a hearing, it's not the Republicans' fault or the Republican invited witnesses' fault that you guys don't have the votes for this package that's going to harm the country. That's not our problem.
I'm not going to get
now
into
we don't
the
have a
merits.
witness.
I'm not getting into the merits of whatever we're doing other than the committee right now. We have no alternative but to continue the hearing, because when would we reconvene it?
Well, that's up to you. I don't get to schedule things. If I get to schedule things, we'd have started at 10.
Yeah, well, I didn't have that choice.
Well, I mean, you're the chairman. Of course you had that choice.
The hearing will continue. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana. For what purpose does Mr. Biggs seek recognition?
Move strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. It's my understanding that the purpose of this bill in the ANS is actually to provide a choice of forum for the victim of sexual harassment and sexual assault. That's my understanding. And I think that is a worthy and noble cause. I think the language on page 2 of the ANS, starting line 19 and extending to line 8 on page 3 are problematic. I hope that those will be revisited and fixed, because I do think that there's a chance that some will actually use the language that's there to try to redefine sexual harassment in a way that's different than has been well established through the case law that's been developed in this area over the last 40 years. So I hope that gets taken care of. But in the meantime, I'm going to, and by the way, I'll suggest that if it does get taken care of, then I will be for the bill, and I think Mr. Buck's amendment is the right answer to that. So, so let me just real quick cover a couple things. And one of which is dealing with Merrick Garland. And I think it is critical that we discuss this, because I do think it is a critical issue as well. And I look back and I think what happened on September 29th, and there was a letter that went to Mr. Garland, the Attorney General. And within a few days, on October 4th, he issued a directive to the FBI and other departmental components to proceed forward to investigate parents who showed up at school board meetings. And what he said was, there's a disturbing spike in these types of incidents of harassment, intimidation, threats of violence. Now, when asked about that, Mr. Garland said, well, I haven't seen any data or reports. He says that he'd seen a newspaper account or something like that. That's what he relied on. And then later, he testified on the 21st that parents would never be considered domestic terrorists. He said, oh my goodness, we would never invoke the Patriot Act on them. And a whistleblower has come forth that the day before that took place said that indeed the Criminal Investigative Division and Counterterrorism Division of the FBI was pressing forward and putting a tag on parents who showed up. They tasked their counterterrorism unit to spy on Americans, parents who happen to exercise their rights to speak at school board meetings, parents who want to make sure their kids' education is appropriate. That's a Soviet-style surveillance. So I'm left saying, well, either he didn't know what was going on, in which case that ought to give us real major pause for concern, or he did know and he lied and perjured himself on both points with regard to designating parents as terrorists and use or misuse and abuse of the Patriot Act on both of those. So you got reports from the whistleblowers that, and we actually have a copy of the memo. We have a copy of the memo that was issued. So this is something that's really serious, and we should have a hearing and bring Merrick Garland in here to answer these serious questions. And with that, I'll yield some time to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Jordan.
Well, I'm just going to make the point, and I appreciate the gentleman yielding in his comments. Earlier, Mr. Gates gave a speech before the place went black. He gave his remarks, and he asked, I think, the appropriate question: what's the number? Yeah. What's the number of Americans who's now have a threat tag on their name? How many moms across this country now have a terrorist tag associated with their name? And guess what? Only one person can give us that answer: the Attorney General of the United States. So the question that Mr. Biggs just raised, Mr. Chairman, is the most important question we have to deal with today. When will you call the Attorney General back and set him right there at that table so we can ask him those questions? That's the question. That's you. Mr. Biggs raised the right question. I yield back to the gentleman from Arizona.
Thank you, and I'll yield my final time to the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Bishop.
I don't think we can do anything to touch the surface here. I would suggest to you that on page 3 of the bill, there is a prohibition of arbitration, pre-dispute arbitration, for any claim federal, state, or tribal in this bill. That's not concern for federalism, but we'll come back and talk about it later, I hope.
The gentleman yields back. We have 2 votes on the House floor. Therefore, we will recess and return immediately after the conclusion of those votes.